Uh, I hope everyone's taking care and doing well. Um, so we'll finish up with the section around elasticity in this session, and then we'll get started with the next chapter as well for this week. Um, again, the assignment has been postponed so that you can do it by the end of this week. So make sure you watch the video, make sure you run through all the video clips on the MindTap platform, and then make sure that you finish up with the homework this week. We'll have office hours on Friday. I'll send out an email soon about how to get into those office hours. So if you have any questions around these lectures, that's the best place to come talk to me. Uh, Another thing which has worked well with other classes so far is to use the discussion thread below the video itself. So if you have any questions, quick questions while you're watching the video which come up, just type them into the discussion thread, and other students can feel free to jump in and answer the questions if you think you know the answer, or I'll obviously be monitoring the thread to make sure that if there's any questions that I'm able to address them as we go along. Okay. All right. So let's dive into the material and talk about the price elasticity of supply. Right. It's very similar to the price elasticity of demand, but we are just going to talk about it in terms of the supply side, right? So let me just get a pen here. So instead of talking about the price elasticity of demand, how does quantity demanded change in response to an increase or decrease in price? Now we're going to talk about how is the quantity supplied going to change with an increase or decrease in the price, right? So that's basically what we're trying to accomplish by studying price elasticity of supply, to understand how quantity supplied reacts to price changes, right? So again, the definition is straightforward, the same as price elasticity for demand. So it's the percentage change in quantity supplied. So instead of quantity demand, it's quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in the price, right? So in layman's terms, loosely speaking, it just measures price sensitivity on the sell side, right? How sensitive are sellers to increases or decreases in prices, okay? So almost the rest of the discussion in this section follows along the same lines as what we've done before with price elasticity of demand, but essentially looking at the supply side, okay? So again, straightforward. So remember that the supply curve is upward sloping. So as the price goes up, so as we move along in this direction in price, the quantity supplied also, sorry, the quantity supplied also keeps going up, right? So that's why we get this positively sloped line, this upward sloping line for the supply curve, because higher prices are good for sellers. So if the price goes up, the quantity supplied also responds, okay? So we'll start with a basic situation where suppose the price is P1 and the quantity supplied is Q1, right? And suppose prices rise by 8%, right? The percentage change in price is 8%, and the percentage change in quantity is 16%. Suppose that's what it is, right? So if this is the case, the price elasticity of supply is basically the percentage change in quantity supplied. The S here essentially represents that we're talking about quantity supplied for a percentage change in price, right? So quantity rose by 16%, so that's percentage change in quantity supplied is 16%. Percentage change in price is 8%. The ratio of those two, 16 over 8, is 2. So the price elasticity of supply in this case would be 2. Okay. Again, as you imagine going from A to B or B to A, we might get different answers for price elasticities. So again, we employ the midpoint method. So instead of looking at it this way, we take the midpoint of the prices, take the midpoint of the quantities, and use that to compute price elasticity of supply, right? So that's basically what we do, okay? Then we'll talk about the varieties of supply curves which can come out of all of this elasticity discussion. So we say that supply is unit elastic if the price elasticity of supply is 1, right? And supply is elastic if the price elasticity of supply is greater than 1, and supply is inelastic if the price elasticity of supply is less than 1, right? So all that means is that if we have unit elastic supply, if the price changes by 10%, the quantity supplied also changes by 10%, so the ratio is exactly 1, okay? If the supply is elastic, if the price changes by 10%, the quantity supplied changes by more than 10%. That's why we get a ratio of greater than 1, because the numerator rises by more than the denominator, so the ratio is greater than 1. And if the supply is inelastic, That is to say, if the price goes up by 10%, the quantity supplied rises by less than 10%, and the ratio is less than 1. Right? That's what it means to get these different varieties of supply curves. Okay? So again, the limiting cases are when supply is perfectly inelastic, right? So when we say supply is perfectly inelastic, when the price elasticity of supply is 0, right? So in this case, the quantity supplied doesn't react to any price changes. The price might go up, might go down, but the quantity supplied is basically the same, right? And the price elasticity of supply, if it's perfectly elastic, then we get price elasticity of infinity, and the supply curve is horizontal, right? So I'll show you what these things look like as we go through the slides, but that's one thing to keep in mind, okay? The other thing to keep in mind is the shape of the supply curve itself. Right? If the flatter the supply curve is, so if you think about this curve which is upward sloping, the flatter that curve is, right, the more elastic the supply is, the more elastic, greater the price elasticity is. So we'll look through some slides, we'll step through some slides describing each of these situations. All right. Um, so let's start with perfectly inelastic supply, right? Perfectly inelastic supply is that there's a price change, so prices increase by 10%, but quantity supplied doesn't change. There's no response in quantity supply, right? You can imagine situations where supply is fairly limited, right? You're not particularly constrained by the prices as much as how much there is of this good available. So whether prices go up or down, you're basically stuck, right? So if the price rises by 10%, the quantity supplied in this case just stays at the same level. At Q1, there's no change in quantity supplied, so the percentage change in quantity is 0, the percentage change in price is 10%, so we get a price elasticity of 0 and an inelastic supply. So there is no elasticity in the supply curve itself. The prices might change, but the quantity supplied doesn't, right? So that generates a vertical supply curve, right? Because the supply is perfectly inelastic, it generates a vertical supply curve, which is to say the quantity is held fixed at this level, the quantity supplied is held fixed at this level. Whatever happens to the price, there's no change in the quantity supply. All right. So sellers have no price sensitivity. They continue to supply the same amount, whether the price is higher or lower. They're going to continue supplying the same amount, and there is zero elasticity in the supply curve. Right. So that's the first case. Right. So as we move along, we'll talk about a more relaxed case about inelastic supply. Again, so we start with the basic setup P1, Q1. Suppose prices rise by 10%, right? Prices are increasing by 10%, but the quantity supplied is going to rise, but by less than 10%, right? So the change in quantity supplied is less than 10%, the change in price is 10%. So this ratio is going to be less than 1 because this number is smaller than this number. This ratio is going to be less than 1, right? Which indicates that if prices go up, sellers like that fact that prices go up, so they are going to increase quantity supplied, but they're constrained in some way by how much they can increase the quantity supplied, such that if the price goes up by 10%, the quantity supplied rises by less than 10%, and you get inelastic supply. Okay, so it's not perfectly inelastic, it's just a bit more constrained, right? It's not that you're going to just stay at the same level of quantity supply no matter what, as is the case with perfectly inelastic supply. In this case, the quantity supplied will go up for sure, but it'll go up by less than what the price went up by, right? The price went up by 10%, the quantity supplied changed by less than 10%, and you get a relatively steep supply curve. So if you have a relatively steep supply curve, that indicates that the elasticity of supply is fairly low, right? So seller's price sensitivity is relatively low, and you get an elasticity of less than 1. Okay. Then we can step through into the intermediate case where we have unit elastic supply. So we start with price P1, Q1. Suppose prices rise again by 10%, the quantity supplied rises by 10%, right? So the price changed by 10%, the quantity supplied also increased by the same measure. So this went up by 10%, this went up by 10%, so the ratio is always 1, right? So we get an intermediate slope, so it's not as steep as the case with the relatively inelastic supply, right? But you get some intermediate case where the seller's price sensitivity is intermediate and elasticity is exactly equal to 1. Right? Elasticity being exactly equal to 1 in this case basically means that as prices rise by 10%, the quantity supplied also rises by the same percentage. Right? Hope this is clear. So again, if there's any questions, use the comment section below to ask them. And again, I'll send out an email about office hours so you can talk to me then as well. Right? So let's keep going. So let's talk about elastic supply. Right? Again, price starts at P1 Q1 and price rises by 10%. So the denominator is changing by 10%, but the response on the supply side is massive, right? The quantity supplied rises by more than 10% in this case, right? So the numerator goes up by more than 10%, where the denominator rises by 10%. So the ratio is going to be greater than 1, right? So you get a relatively flat supply curve, right? It's relatively flat, which is to say, as prices change by 10%, there is a lot of flexibility in how much quantity can be supplied, right? This is basically supply which is on demand, right? If you're able to respond relatively quickly to price changes and ramp up how much supply you are able and willing to supply into the market. And so if the prices go up by 10%, the quantity supplied rises by more than 10%. This is a case where we say that the supply curve is basically elastic, right? We have elastic supply. The supply curve, the shape of it is relatively flat. So you can see that it's getting flatter, the supply curve, as we move through the cases. And price sensitivity is relatively high. And you're going to get an elasticity of greater than 1. And the last case is about perfectly elastic supply, right? So basically, quantity supplied is, price changes by 0%, but you can indefinitely change how much quantity supplied can change by, right? Percentage change in quantity can be any percent for no percentage change in price, right? So this is a market where sellers are not responding to the price signal per se. They have a lot to sell and they're willing to supply it into this market at the price the market set. So there has to be no incentive from the market by prices rising for us to ramp up supply. Supply can change at will, right? The quantity supplied can change at will. So the denominator is 0%. If you divide by 0, you're going to get infinite, right? 1 over 0 is always infinity. So you're going to get a supply curve which is horizontal, right? So the price is at the price and you can have any quantity supplied that you want at this price. Seller's price sensitivity is extreme, right? So if even for small changes in prices, you're going to ramp up externally the quantity supplied, and the elasticity, if you calculate it, as it turns out, is infinite. Okay. So those are the various kinds of supply curves you might encounter. Remember, the flatter the curve is, the more elastic the supply is. So if the curve is fairly flat, then you're going to have relatively very elastic supply in this market. And if the supply curve is relatively steep, then you're going to have fairly inelastic supply. Okay. All right. Hope that these things are clear. Again, this is basically we looked at all of this in much more detail when we did elasticity of demand in the previous lecture, but this is basically a continuation of that discussion. Okay? All right. So determinants of price elasticity. Okay. There is a greater price elasticity of supply when there is sellers are able to more easily change the quantity that they produce. Right? So if you think about two types of goods that can be sold in the market, beachfront property and the supply of new cars, right? And if you consider which would have the greater elastic supply, it's obvious that the good which has where you have the capacity to ramp up supply relatively quickly, that will have the greater elasticity of supply. So in this case, if you think about beachfront property is fairly limited, beaches are fairly limited, properties are fairly limited. Even if the prices of beachfront property go up by a lot, it takes a long time for supply to meet the price increase, right? For us to quantity supplied to also rise by the same percentage as price increases, because it takes a long time to buy that land, build this property, and do all of these things. On the other hand, if you think about the supply of new cars, right, if prices go up, if there's a lot of people buying cars and price in the market is going up by about 10%, you have the capacity to ramp up production immediately, right? You just call your factory and you can basically start ramping up and putting out new cars into the market, flooding the market with new supply. So if I consider these two goods, beachfront property versus new cars, I can produce new cars more easily was relative to beachfront property. So we would think that the elasticity of new cars, the elasticity of new cars in that market is going to be higher than that in the market for beachfront property. Right? And again, price elasticity of supply is greater in the long run than the short run, right? So this again makes sense. If you think about prices going up, that says that, oh yeah, so you can produce more of this particular good, but it takes a while, right? So it takes a while for you to adjust to this new reality that prices are permanently higher in this market. So it takes some time. So in the longer run, you're better able to respond to the price changes and ramp up supply than you're in the short run. So if you consider price elasticities of most goods in the short run versus the long run, the elasticity of supply is much greater in the long run than in the short run. Okay, makes sense. I hope this is clear. Again, it's a continuation. It's very analogous to the situation we've already talked about with the price elasticity of demand. Okay. All right. So let's look at an example to make sure that we can fix ideas here quickly. Um, so supply of beachfront property is inelastic. The supply of new cars is elastic. Suppose population growth causes demand for both goods to double, right? At each price, the quantity demanded, we are doing equilibrium analysis here. So we are considering what happens. Suppose the population in this country or wherever it is doubles, right? So you're going to have double the quantity demanded at any given price. The question is, for which product will the price change the most? Okay. For which product will the quantity change the most? All right, so let's consider these two cases one after the other. So if I think about beachfront property, right? So there's a demand curve for beachfront property. So D1 here, it's downward sloping, essentially tells me this is the demand curve for beachfront property initially, and the supply curve for beachfront property, and it's relatively steep, suggesting that the elasticity in this market, price elasticity of supply, is relatively low, right? So suppose there is an increase in demand. So instead of the demand curve shifts up from D1 to D2, population doubles. People want to buy twice as much beachfront property because there's twice as many people. So demand curve shifts from D1 to D2, right? So the new equilibrium is where the new demand curve meets the existing supply curve, right? This point of intersection between the new demand curve and the existing supply curve will determine the equilibrium price in this market and the equilibrium quantity in this market. Okay. So if you think about the situation, just by the way we've drawn these things, because supply is inelastic, there's going to be a bigger response on the price side of things. So if the prices go up by a lot more, then does quantity supply, right? Because it takes a while for this market to basically supply new beachfront property. There might be a lot of demand for it, but it takes a while for the supply curve to respond to these price increases. And that's what's basically shown in the fact that the supply curve here is relatively steep, right? Because it's an elastic supply, right? So we expect that the prices in this case, in the case of the beachfront property, we expect the prices to rise more than the quantity supplied of beachfront property. Okay. All right. So think about the second case with new cars, right? Again, there's a demand curve for new cars. There's a supply curve for new cars. And if you look at the shape, the way I've drawn the supply curve is relatively flat, suggesting that there is a lot more elasticity in the supply of new cars relative to that of beachfront property, right? So population, again, is the same situation. Population doubles, so the demand curve shifts out, right? So there are twice as many new cars are being sought after. So you're going to get a massive increase in the demand curve. So the new equilibrium in this market is where the new demand curve meets the existing supply curve. So the market clears at a price P2 and quantity Q2. So if I think about the increases in prices, the increase in price is relatively small relative to the increase in quantity supply. So there's a bigger impact on price, a bigger impact on quantity than there is on the price, right? So in a nutshell, if there is equivalent increases in demands for two goods, the good with the higher price elasticity of supply will respond by increasing the quantity supplied a lot more than by increasing the prices a lot, right? So these are two cases where all the differences in the response in prices and quantities supplied are driven purely by how the supply curve, what the elasticity of the supply curve itself is in the market. All right. Um, Again, if there's any questions, comments, just make sure that you leave them below. Right. All right. So consider the case where how the price elasticity of supply can vary on the same curve. Right. For the same market, we can think about different price elasticities. Right. Suppose the price is 3 and it goes up to 4. Right. So the price was $3. Now it went up to $4, and the quantity supplied goes up from 100 to 200. Here there is a bigger increase in the quantity supplied relative to the price increase, and you might have uh, basically, right, when the price rises from 3 to 4, if you use the midpoint method, that's a 29% increase. So, and the quantity demanded rises from 100 to 200. Anyway, so the big issue here is that initially, when the supply is fairly low in the market, when the quantity supplied is fairly low inside the market itself, when you're initially starting out in a new market, elasticity is large, right? So if the price goes up even by a small amount, you're going to respond by increasing the quantity by a lot because you have the capacity to increase the quantity by a lot initially, right? So as more and more quantities gets into this market, so if you consider the top end of the supply curve, so when prices rise from $12 to $15 instead, that's a big increase in prices. Quantity supplied, the response on the quantity supplied starts to get weaker and weaker, right? Mostly because you're starting to hit capacity limits. So early on, when there is not enough supply in the market, even when the price goes up by a small amount, it becomes profitable to start supplying a lot more into this market because the prices are rising by even by small increases in prices have big responses on the supply side, right? But if you already have a lot of this quantity of this good in this market, the response to price increases starts to weaken, right? So prices can rise by a lot, but because you already have a lot in this market, there's limited capacity to increase supply. So once you start hitting capacity constraints, even though the price increases might be big, the response on the quantity supplied side can be fairly small, right? So even within the same supply curve, you will have different regions with different elasticities. And generally speaking, as the quantity supplied goes up, the elasticity gets smaller and smaller. The elasticity, it's a way of saying the supply curve becomes less and less elastic as the quantity supplied keeps going up. Okay, all right. Hope that's clear. So we'll finish up with two interesting things, right? So we'll talk about um, other elasticities that you can capture. So in general, when we talk about elasticity, right, we're talking about in this case of demand. When we talk about elasticity of demand, we are just talking about what is the percentage change in quantity demanded when something else changes. When we talk about price elasticity of demand, that something else is the price. We can also talk about other things like income elasticity of demand, right? How much does the quantity demanded for a good change when the consumer's income changes, right? So it is a case where we are trying to establish the relationship between quantity demanded for a good and changes in consumer income, right? So for normal goods, we expect income elasticity to be greater than zero, right? Again, to calculate this before we get there, percentage change in quantity demanded, that's on the numerator, divided by the percentage change in income. Again, use the midpoint method to establish these things, right? These are also what's known as cross price elasticities. We'll get into that in a second, but this is a case where we have income elasticity of demand, right? So if you think about normal goods, we've established this distinction already before. When we talk about normal goods, we're talking about goods where as you get richer, or as is formal way of saying, as your income goes up, the quantity demanded of that good also goes up, right? These are most goods in the economy. As you have more and more money, you buy more and more of this particular kind of good, right? So when incomes go up, if it's a normal good, we expect price elasticity to be greater than zero, which is to say percentage change in quantity is going to be positive relative to the percentage change in income. When we talk about inferior goods, these are goods that you don't want to buy as much of as you get richer and richer. As income goes higher, people buy more and more different, more luxury type consumption goods. So inferior goods are anything that you would buy because you can't afford anything else, but as your income improves, as the income goes up, you want to buy less and less of this good, right? So an inferior good, we expect the income elasticity to be less than zero because the percentage change in quantity is going to be negative relative to the percentage change in income, right? So that's one other elasticity that we can capture, the income elasticity of demand. We can also talk about cross price elasticity of demand, right? So we can talk about how much does the quantity demanded of one good respond to the change in the price of another good, right? We are not talking about the uh, change in price of the same good. We are talking about change in the price of a different good, right? So again, percentage change in quantity demanded for the first good divided by the percentage change in the price of the second good. That's what makes it a cross price elasticity. So we are not talking about, so in general, formally when people define these things, they talk about own price elasticity and cross price elasticity. With own price elasticity, we are talking about the percentage change in quantity demanded for a percentage change in the price of the same good that we are talking about. When we're talking about cross price elasticities, we're talking about the percentage change in quantity demanded of one good when the price of some other good which is related to this good is changing. Right? Again, if you imagine, we talked about two kinds of relations between goods. Goods can be either substitutes or complements, right? Substitutes basically means if the price of one good goes up, right? So if the price of the second good goes up, the quantity demanded of the first good also goes up because they're substitutes for each other. So if the price of the second good is going to go up, that's what's in the denominator. The quantity demanded of the first good goes up because you buy the cheaper good now, which is the first good because the price of the second good went up. So for substitutes, for two goods which are substitutes, we expect the cross price elasticity of demand to be greater than zero. Right? And for complements, these are goods which are bought together. If the price of what the second good goes up, then the quantity demanded of the first good also goes down. So when the price of one good goes up, of the second good goes up, not only do you buy less of the second good, you also buy less of the first good along with it, right? So this is the example of bagels and cream cheese, for instance. If the price of cream cheese goes up, not only do you respond by decreasing how much cream cheese you buy, but because if you don't have enough, you don't have as much cream cheese as you had before, you would also buy fewer bagels. And that's what we expect, that the cross price elasticity here should be less than zero because the percentage change in quantity demand is going to be negative for a change in the price of the second good. Yeah. So we've talked about four different kinds of elasticities: the price elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of supply, the income elasticity of demand, and the cross price elasticity of different goods. Right? Okay. Hope these things are clear, but we'll look at a few examples to finish off this discussion, and then we'll jump into the next bit of the course. Right? Okay. So let's talk about a case where good news for farming can be bad news for farmers. Right? Let's think about setting up a situation where this is going to be a case. So there's a new hybrid of wheat which becomes available, which can increase production per acre by 20%. Right? A new technology which is available, this new hybrid technology which is available, where you can increase on the same unit of land on a per acre basis, you can increase production by 20%. Right? That's an improvement. Okay. So think about what can happen here, right? So let's start with the initial basic setup as we always do, okay? So there is an initial demand for this good, an initial supply for this good, right? So initially the price in this market, right, let me let that finish. Okay, so this initially the supply here is S1, the demand here is whatever this demand curve. So initially the price in this market is $3, right? And the quantity of wheat in this market is 100 units. That's what the equilibrium was before, right? So suddenly there's a new increase in technology, and the amount of wheat that is made on a per acre basis is increasing by 20%. So the supply curve, the supply of wheat goes up, so the supply curve shifts from S1 to S2, right? So if the supply curve shifts from S1 to S2, there is a decrease in the price, right? There is in the new equilibrium, the new supply curve meets the existing demand curve. The price is lower, and the quantity is moves up, but moves up by a smaller amount than the price falls by, right? This is purely driven by the fact that the demand for wheat is relatively inelastic, right? If you think about wheat is not a very expensive item to begin with, and there is only so much wheat that you can consume, right? So when the price goes down by a lot, the response for on the demand side for wheat, the elasticity of demand is going to be fairly low because, yeah, it's cheaper. Wheat is definitely cheaper than it was, but I'm not going to follow myself trying to get to the market to buy as much wheat as possible because wheat is relatively cheap and the price has fallen, but I don't respond by altering. I might buy a little bit more and store it because it's cheaper. So maybe I want to lock in the price, so I want to buy a little bit more while it's cheaper, but I'm not going to change it by a whole lot. Right? So in a certain sense, this is a case where there's an improvement in production technology, right? There is a new technology which is available, which allows for supply to go up, but because demand is relatively inelastic, it might have negative consequences, right? In a certain sense, if you think about this uh, in the case of doing equilibrium analysis, initially the revenue, right? Let me see if I can draw here. So initially the revenue from this market was this big. Okay, so that rectangle there, so 100 times 3, which is $300 worth of revenue was being made, right? Once this new technology came out, the price went down to 2, the quantity supplied went up to 110. So now if I think about the area of the second rectangle here, that is basically 2 times 110, which is 220, which is to say revenue actually fell, right? Something which was beneficial for actual wheat production is now is actually having a impact on the revenues of farmers themselves, right? So that's purely driven by the fact that the demand in this market has not changed and is relatively inelastic, right? So if when the prices fall, this is the decrease in revenue by from the fact that there is I'm selling uh, uh, on a per unit basis, I'm losing about $1 worth of revenue there. So $100 worth of revenue on the initial 100 units I was going up, and this is the increase in revenue, right? So this is the plus, this is the minus, right? So I'm losing $100 in revenue here, and I'm gaining 10 new. I'm able to sell 10 new units of wheat, but I'm now at a price of 2 units. So I've lost $100 here. I've gained $20 here. In net, I've lost $80. So that's what if you think about the areas of these rectangles, that's what they also suggest. So the area of this rectangle initially was $300. So the revenues from wheat production here was $300. The area of this rectangle, once the supply curve shifted out, is basically 220, and there's a $80 reduction in wheat revenues. Right? So this is a case where an advance in technology, which we generally think is a good thing, has a adverse impact on the people who are employing this technology because purely driven by the fact that the demand here is relatively inelastic. Right? Hope that's clear. All right, so let's talk about a second case and then we'll conclude this session. So OPEC, so if you don't know what OPEC is, it's the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. So this is a oil cartel, right? So it's basically all the Middle Eastern oil producers together formed a cartel. A cartel is basically where different parties collude amongst each other. So you can think about countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and Yemen and UAE and so on. They all band together and decide how much they will supply of oil into the market. Right? They will artificially contain how much oil gets supplied into the market. So if you can constrict supply in this market, you can artificially keep prices high. So a cartel basically works as long as everyone does the same thing. There's coordinated action between all the different parties inside the cartel. But if any of them deviates from the established plan, the cartel can break down quickly, right? So that's the reason OPEC was formed to keep oil prices high for as long as possible. But uh, let's talk about what happened in this case, right? In 1973-74 and 1971 to 81. Let's talk about what the situation was, right? So let's think about the oil market in the short run, and then we'll go on and do more equilibrium analysis, right? So let's think about the oil market. So initially, there's a demand for oil, Demand for oil is relatively inelastic. You need oil, so prices increase by a lot. Quantity demanded for oil doesn't go down by a whole bunch, right? Because prices can go up till the cows come home. You still need oil to generate electricity, to make goods and services, what have you. Oil is very important. So the demand curve here is relatively steep. Okay. Initially, the supply curve was S1. So you have this story here that initially the supply curve is S1, there's the demand curve, and the price was P1. Okay. So in the short run, there was an oil shock. So 1971, 72, this is the Yom Kippur War when Arab countries invaded Israel, and there was a war which broke out in the Middle East, which basically disrupted supply lines of oil for many months on end. So there was a constriction in supply of oil, right? So when the oil there's a decrease in the supply of oil, the supply curve shifts to the left, oil prices spike by a lot, right? So in the short run, there is a large increase in the price, right? Because in the short run, you can't go really. Sorry, let me hold off on that. In the short run, there's no place for people who want to buy oil to go, right? You can't really respond to it. All you have to do is to absorb the higher prices. You might respond by buying a little less oil than you were before, right? So initially, if this was what you're buying, you would respond by buying a little less oil than you were before, but not by much, right? In the short run, you're captive. You really can't do much. You still need the oil. The prices are higher. You just swallow the bullet there. But in the longer run, we expect the demand curve to be much flatter, right? So in the longer term, what happens is that the demand curve is much more elastic. So you can find alternative suppliers, right? You can try to basically try to find different sources for oil. So if it's not OPEC, you go to Venezuela, you go to Russia, you go to the Ukraine, you try and find alternative sources from where you can buy oil. So in the longer run, the demand is much more elastic, right? In the longer run, you can respond to the price changes um, a little bit better, right? So this is basically a story where the longer run, the price in the long run, the demand curve is fairly elastic. So in the long run, even though the supply change is basically the same, the price will not increase by as much, right? So that's what we expect to see. So that there is in the short run, elasticities are much lower both for supply and demand than they are in the long run. In the long run, we expect the elasticities of both supply and demand to be much higher, right? Okay, so that's basically the discussion around elasticity. So a quick summary. We talked about when we talk about elasticity, we are trying to measure responsiveness to price changes or responsiveness of quantity demanded or quantity supplied to what something else changing. When we think about price elasticity of demand, we are talking about the percentage change in quantity demanded by the percentage change in price. When it's less than 1, we say demand is inelastic. When greater than 1, we say it's elastic. Okay. When demand is inelastic, total revenue rises when price falls. Price rises, sorry. So when demand is inelastic, we saw that when the demand curve is fairly relatively steep, total revenue does rise when price rises. When the demand is elastic, total revenue falls when price rises. Right? We've seen these cases in the last session. Again, short run versus long run, demand is less elastic in the short run, right? Demand becomes more elastic in the long run for necessities. Demand is higher for necessities versus luxury goods. It's is less elastic for broadly defined goods versus narrowly defined goods, and for goods with few close substitutes, right? So when we talk about price elasticity of supply, we talk about the percentage change in quantity supplied for a percentage change in price. When it's less than 1, supply is inelastic. When it's greater than 1, we say supply is elastic. And price elasticity of supply is greater in the long run than it is in the short run. Okay. We can also find other elasticities. So income elasticity of demand measures how much quantity demanded responds to changes in buyer's income. So it's the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in the buyer's income. Cross price elasticity of demand measures price sensitivity of a particular good when the price of some other good changes, right? So when what is a change in the quantity demanded for one good when there is a percentage change in the price for another good. Okay. Again, we can use all of these tools, these basic frameworks, to basically do equilibrium analysis like we've already shown. Okay, so that's the discussion around elasticity. I hope this was clear. Again, if there's any questions, leave them in the comments below the video, and I will send out an email later in the week about office hours on Friday that you can jump into and ask questions if you have any. So make sure you finish up with chapter 3 homework for this week. There's going to be a second video this week, so we'll get started with chapter 6 as well this week, and I'll see you in the next one. Hope everyone's doing well and taking care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next video.